Hey guys, what's going on again? It's me, Jay. Let's pick up where I left off. This is part two of my Von Erich story, the story of the Texas wrestling family, the most infamous Texas wrestling family, and possibly the most infamous family in wrestling. Anyway, where we left off last time, it was the second Super Bowl, second Star Wars show at the Texas Stadium with Kerry Von Erich versus Ric Flair, and Ric Flair had Kerry beat him with this backdrop, and the reason why he had him beat him with the backdrop was because Kerry was always messed up on drugs. He couldn't really remember long finishes, so he figured he'd give him something easy. But anyway, Kerry Von Erich wins, and this was the David Von Erich Memorial Show. This was the memorial show for his brother David, who passed away. That they said was acute enteritis. Basically, his intestines exploded. But other reports, like from Bruiser Brody's biography, indicate that that wasn't the case. That it was actually drugs, and Bruiser Brody was shoving copious amounts, flushing copious amounts of drugs down the toilet in Japan. But it's a big moment for the fans because again they reached since the 1960s. Fritz von Erich was never able to capture that gold, and David von Erich was never able to capture it despite wrestling Harley Race a number of different times. He was never able to capture it, but Kerry von Erich finally captures the championship and finally becomes the champion of the National Wrestling Alliance. So Fritz thinks he's going to hold it for a number of years. He doesn't. He holds it for like a couple of weeks, and then they finally give it back to Ric Flair. So it doesn't even matter. It's like the NWA only gave it to him because his brother died. You know what I mean? So they're back to the drawing board. They're back to the races again, trying to recapture that championship. And Fritz is trying to politic for the championship. Now, some of you guys might say, well, what difference does it make? Wrestling is not real. The championship is not real. What difference does it make that he wins the championship? Well, the difference was that during that time, the wrestling world was divided into different territories, and the territory that had the heavyweight the NWA heavyweight championship would be the territory with the most political power and political sway. So, being that Fritz was a promoter, he would want his territory to have the championship. And one of the things Fritz always pushed and pushed was always saying in a lot of these interviews too that Kerry and all the other boys were going to be champions. Because he even says, even when David died, he's like, all my other boys are going to be cha- champions. So Kerry finally achieves it, but the NWA doesn't have faith in him, and they give it back to Ric Flair right away because his chances where he has shows and he never shows up. They're the no shows. Famously, because they were on the Christian network, not only were their productions further in 1984, 83, 84 than any other wrestling company, because other wrestling companies they were involved with local affiliates. This was before the business with MTV and AWA started doing business with ESPN and even Southeastern Channel, the Commerce Network. Ron Fuller's territory started doing business with the Commerce Network. This is before that. So the Christian network, the Christian Broadcasting Network that Fritz Von Erich and World Class was a part of, first they gave it the name World Class. It was just like Southwest Sports or NWA Dallas at that time. And secondly, they created a lot of innovations, mics in the ring, multi-camera shots, and made it like it was a real television show. You know, And another advantage that they gave it was that the Christian network was broadcast in places in the Middle East, particularly in Lebanon, the border states between Lebanon and Israel, catering to the Lebanese Christian community, similar to how ABN was, David Wood and Sam Shamoon show, basically reaching out to Middle Eastern Christians And because of this satellite that started in Lebanon and beamed out all the way to Jerusalem, the Von Erichs had a huge following in Israel. Most of their fans were located, believe it or not, in Israel, a place that is not really known for wrestling. In fact, Shimon Peres, the old prime minister of Israel, said in an interview that even though the tensions were high in the mid 1980s between Palestinians and Israelis, as they have been for the last 100 years, let's be completely, you know, frank about it. We talked about it a lot in this channel about the tensions in the Middle East. Shimon Peres even said that when the Von Erichs were on TV, tensions just immediately stopped. In fact, there was this one incident in like 1985 where Kevin Von Erich, one of the brothers, was going overseas to Israel and he didn't show, and they almost tore the entire place down. It was basically Hulkamania. What Hulkamania was in the United States, that's what this was in Israel. So they go overseas to Israel. Um, Mike Von Erich is wrestling a match. He dislocates his shoulder, and because of that, and because of the immense heat, and because of the infections that he got, he's that shoulder injury. He suffers toxic shock syndrome, in which poison gets into his blood, and he almost dies. And the amount of sympathy, the amount of support that comes out from him from the wrestling fans is just astonishing. I mean, the Von Erichs were so huge in the Dallas area and so huge all over the world. Basically, that World Class Championship Wrestling could have been the first wrestling promotion before the WWE, especially with the girls. They were known for having a huge female following. Besides the Israeli population, especially the Israeli Druze population, which we talk about on this channel, we have a video in the archives in this channel on the Druze holiday, um, honoring their founder Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. They were huge with the Druze community. In fact, people even thought that Kevin Von Erich was a member of the Druze community, which is very ironic considering that Fritz Von Erich's character originally was a Nazi. When I think about things I want to laugh at, the fact that an old Nazi character's kids become the biggest stars in the state of Israel is one of those the great ironies of history. But anyway, Mike is hurt. And Mike, never, like I said, never really wanted to be in the wrestling business anyway, but he was pushed into it by his dad. So he gets out of the hospital. It's a miracle. But because he's not wrestling and because they were the top stars of the territory, the dad pushes him back into the ring, just like Vince Sr. did to Bruno Sammartino when the Ali and Inoki fight wasn't drawing in '76. He pushed him back into the ring. Fritz does the exact same thing with Mike Von Erich, and eventually that would lead to a lot of issues with Mike. And in 1985, he uh, also committed suicide. So 85, it was like, man, this territory is five, of course, is when everything turned around, when Vince McMahon had the first WrestleMania, when was getting involved in wrestling, Mr. T is getting involved in wrestling. Hulk Hogan had already jumped from the AWA to the WWF. So the international scope and the national scope that the Von Erichs and World Class had is no more. Because Vince Sr. is on the march, and Vince Jr., Vince McMahon, is coming for everybody's territory, wanting to take everybody's top talent, and start promoting in their cities and create the national and international phenomenon that we know today as the World Wrestling Federation or World Wrestling Entertainment. And there was really nothing Fritz Von Erich could do to stop it, because two of the top stars, both his sons, had now passed away, and his top heel, Gino Hernandez, also in 1986 dies of a drug overdose. They say it's cocaine intoxication. There are some beliefs Among people that it may have been a mafia hit on him, he was found dead in his home. He was doing a storyline at the time where he and English wrestler, the gentleman Chris Adams, were feuding, and Chris Adams was blinded. You can see this clips on the WWE Network. Chris Adams actually plays it up really good. The blinded thing, just like with Junkyard Dog, they were doing the big thing, and they were supposed to have the blow off in '86 of the Star Wars show, and that doesn't happen either. So a top heel has passed away, two top bay faces have passed away, two of the boys have passed away. So but Fritz just keeps chugging and chugging along. '86, he loses his TV deal with CBN. He sues them. '87, um, another one of his TV contracts goes to shit, and he goes to legal court with um, Bill Watts, trying to not have Bill Watts expand into his territory because Bill Watts now, even though he doesn't have the Junkyard Dog anymore, Junkyard Dog jumped to WWE. He wants to expand and change his Mid South Wrestling name from Mid South Wrestling to Universal Wrestling Federation in '86 and '87. He's going into Fritz's territory, trying to take over Little Fritz. Suddenly, Fritz has contracted, and he doesn't have the momentum that he had in the early '80s. Then he tries to push his other son, Chris Von Erich, who has asthma and who had prednisone, which stunted his growth and gave him brittle bones, into the professional wrestling business. Chris Von Erich wanted to be in professional wrestling. He wanted to be there, but he was too small. So, but Fritz still trying to push him in. And another scheme that Fritz comes up with is in his lack of star power. Fritz decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create another Von Erich, a fake Von Erich. And he gets this guy, Ricky Vaughn, who's a football player in the Dallas area. He wrestled a little bit in Don Owens' territory in the Pacific Northwest. And he dresses him up as the cousin of the Von Erichs. And people know that who this guy Rick Vaughn is. They know that he's not a Von Erich. And people are coming up to Gary Hart and saying, you know what? I don't like the Von Erichs anymore. They lie. He says, well, what do you mean they lie? They say that Ricky Vaughn is Waldo Von Erich's son, Lance Von Erich, but he's not. He's not a real Von Erich. You know what I mean? So this idea to create a fake Von Erich makes the fans turn off, because here we've been with you. We were with you when David died. We're with you when Mike died. We're with you even when Gino Hernandez died. We're with you with all the business things. We're with you with getting Chris into the wrestling business, even though he's not physically fit enough to do it. And then on top of that, in '86, on top of the business things and the dealings and promotional wars with Bill Watts and all that, and Vince McMahon breathing down their necks, and Gino Hernandez dying, and Mike Von Erich dying, and people discovering that Waldo Von Erich is not a true Von Erich. On top of that, Kerry Von Erich suffers a huge motorcycle accident in which his foot eventually has to be amputated. And by the time he makes it into the main event again in 1988, when he's wrestling Jerry Lawler in the Super Clash, because to combat Vince McMahon's national expansion into the global and national market, all the other promoters, Fritz Von Erich included, and at first Jim Crockett, who was the president of the NWA and promoting out of the Carolinas, decides that we're going to do an inter-promotional pay-per-view Super Clash in '85. But by the third Super Clash in '88, in which Kerry Von Erich, who now has one leg, has to wrestle, he's wrestling against Jerry Lawler, who's the AWA champion, and he's the world-class champion, because in '86 also, Fritz Von Erich decides he's going to leave the NWA and he's going to try to be a national promotion. Pushed his back against the wall with the inter-promotional wars with Bill Watts. He decides that he's going to be a national promoter, and he's going to leave the National Wrestling Alliance and crown his own champion. The first champion was Rick Rude, and then Black Bart, somebody that nobody was even behind. But by the time 1988 rolls around, um, he puts the belt on his son, Kerry Von Erich. People don't know that he has one leg. Kerry Von one foot. Kerry Von Erich showers with his boot on. He never has allowed himself to be seen without his boot on. He's keeping it completely hidden and completely secret. And it's not until he's seen the match with Colonel DeVere, the Colonel DeVere actually rips the foot off. But some people do know. Some people do know about it, and one of the people that knows about it is Vince McMahon. He calls the Chicago, the Illinois Athletic Commission where they're having the event. It's AWA champion Jerry Lawler versus WCCW champion Kerry Von Erich, and he decides he's going to snitch and tell the people that Kerry Von Erich is wrestling with a prosthetic leg, and there's a law against you know wrestling and boxing exhibitions with somebody with a prosthetic leg. So even though the AWA is really and WCCW are really no threat to the WWE at this time in '88, because this is the time when they're doing business with Trump. This is the time WrestleMania 4. They've already shut out Jim Crockett Promotions by calling the cable companies and telling the cable companies if they want to carry Starrcade '87, they can't carry WrestleMania 4. So they've already shut out Jim Crockett. They want to try to do the same thing to AWA in their first pay-per-view. And this is Kerry Von Erich's first time on pay-per-view. And Vince McMahon is trying to shut it down. It doesn't shut down. It's actually a great match that they have. And Jerry Lawler tells the story that um, even though Kerry Von Erich was messed up on drugs and painkillers and everything, Kerry has the razors in his taped to his wrist, and he's putting his boot on, and all of a sudden he's putting his gear on, his bands, the bands around his arms, and he cuts um, his entire body up with razors because the finish that Vern Gagne, the boss of the AWA, had come up with was blood stoppage because he didn't want to switch the belt off Lawler. Although in hindsight, he should have switched the belt off Jerry Lawler because Jerry Lawler ended up leaving with the AWA championship and leaving the AWA high and dry in 1980 in 1988. But anyway, it's a Kerry Von Erich versus Jerry Lawler. Go look this one up. Super Clash 3 on the WWE Network. It is a complete bloodbath. And they say that Kerry Von Erich was high the whole time, but you can't really tell. Okay, by 1989, this is where the problems start to set in. Again, Fritz doesn't have TV. He does have ESPN for a while because he's co-promoting him in the AWA, and AWA has business with them. But he's really falling on hard times financially. So the idea that Kevin and Kerry have is to sell the promotion to Jerry Jarrett. He did this with Jerry Lawler, who's the top talent in Jerry Jarrett's Memphis promotion. And they figure, oh, well, Jerry Jarrett could combine it with the CWA, his Memphis promotion, and create the USWA. So Jerry Jarrett comes down, he buys the promotion from Fritz Von Erich. And that's when Fritz says to Jerry Jarrett, they're in Fritz Von Erich's living room. And Fritz Von Erich tells Jerry Jarrett, look, these two boys, pointing to his sons, Kevin and Kerry, they're two dope heads. They're not going to be dependable. They're not going to show up with you on time because it was supposed to be a co-ownership with Jerry Jarrett's promotion and the two boys. And Fritz says he wants nothing to do with it. And finally, they sell the promotion and they have a cage match. Eric Embry, with Eric Embry in it. And one of the people that the manager Skandar Akbar managed. And that was the last time they saw World Class, and they actually tore the banners down from world class. But by then it was already over, and it became part of the USWA. Eventually, Kevin Von Erich fights in court to get some of the proceeds back, and he launches the IC, ICW, ICCWA in Boston with a local Boston promotion. But it's never the same like it was. And then in 1990, Kerry Von Erich, as the Texas Tornado, finally jumps um, to the World Wrestling Federation, and he wins the Intercontinental Championship ultimately in Hong Kong and WrestleMania 6. Um, uh, Now, Ultimate Warrior, who was oddly enough, Ultimate Warrior himself was part of World Class Championship Wrestling under Gary Hart's tutelage as the Dingo Warrior. Now he's in the WWF. He's at the top of the card. He wins the WWF Championship WrestleMania 6. He then ha- has to surrender the IC Championship. So they have a tournament. Kurt Hennig wins the tournament. And the guy that beats Kurt Hennig is the Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich. He holds it for a couple of months, and he's actually pretty over in the World Wrestling Federation. But in 1992, they let him go because, his drug use, and he had a lot of DUIs. And there's one famous incident in St. Louis where the WWF show was busted by the police with drugs, and they have their own drug issues with Dr. Zahorian, the medical doctor in the WWE, that will come to a head in the 1994 trial of Vince McMahon that we talked about a lot. So they had to let Kerry Von Erich go, and unfortunately, that leads to the death of Kerry Von Erich in 1993. But prior to that, Chris Von Erich, when Jerry Jarrett took over, like I said, Fritz was trying to push Chris into the business, even though he was undersized. Jerry Jarrett makes Chris Von Erich one of the top stars of the new USWA promotion. And but he's not getting over. He's not doing what his brothers were doing. They're not setting the world on fire. USWA, the new version of WCCW, is not doing anything really. You know, they're not really drawing any money, and Chris is feeling like he can't make it in the wrestling business. So he like his brother Mike, he commits suicide, and this happens while Kerry is in the World Wrestling Federation. And Kerry had a conversation with Bret Hart in which he says, I want to join my brothers. I want to commit suicide. And Bret Hart, and other people that, like his even this parole officer, tries to talk him out of it. And he is almost going to go to jail if he doesn't, um, if he doesn't really comply with, what his parole officers and stuff says. So finally, in 1993, Kerry Von Erich also commits suicide, and he becomes the last of the Von Erich boys to pass away in the way that they did. And in 1988, Bruiser Brody, also the incident with Bruiser Brody and Jose Gonzalez happens, in which Jose Gonzalez shoots Bruiser Brody. Stabs Bruiser Brody in backstage area in Bayamon, Puerto Rico, and just tragic, tragic stuff. And finally, in 2009 in Houston, Texas, at WrestleMania 25, the Von Erichs, with only Kerry Von Erich to receive it, is inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Recently, there's talks about a movie called The Iron Claw, starring Zac Efron, depicting the life of the Von Erich family. And I think this would be really cool because people don't really know a lot about the Von Erich family, and they had a huge impact on professional wrestling and pop culture in the 80s. I mean, for Shimon Peres, former Prime Minister of Israel, to say what he said, who knows if it's true, but for their impact to reach that far, in Israel, and I've talked to with some of my Israeli friends, and they say that it's true that the Von Erich kids were really known in Israel, and just the amount of girls that would throw themselves at the Von Erichs. You know what I mean? They kind of reminded me of like the wrestling version of the Jacksons, just the mania surrounding them. And I just wish some of them would have made their way to the World Wrestling Federation. In fact, in the 80s, like 83, 84, like around the time when David Von Erich first passed away, they were being talked to, their stuff was being talked about in the World Wrestling Federation. WWE didn't have Hulk Hogan at the time, he didn't jump yet, and they had the show All American Wrestling, where they would feature wrestling matches from other territories in their territory, right? So there was talk that maybe Fritz Von Erich, kind of like Stu Hart did, or kind of like the Los Angeles territory when Vince bought it out in '82, would collaborate with Vince instead of collaborating with Vern like they did, or being part of the National Wrestling Alliance like they were before, like other territories did. But that didn't happen, you know, and they never really got a shot in the except for Kerry Von Erich. And then he started finished. World class, a lot of stars besides the Von Erichs. Iceman King Parsons was famous there. Kamala had a stint there. Bruiser Brody, of course. Bruiser Brody was even the booker at one time when Undertaker got his start there. Stone Cold Steve Austin, but he got his start during the Memphis years there. The story with Chris Adams was crazy. Man, Chris Adams, gentleman Chris Adams, later would be arrested for headbutting this stewardess and killing her on a flight back, international flight back from Britain. And then later, in 2000, he would actually be shot by his roommates after he was on HBH. He was all in a maniac craze, choking this roommate, and the roommate would shoot him. You know, so he had a really tragic life too. He was going out with Lady Blossom, who became Stone Cold Steve Austin's first wife, Jeannie Clark. Most wrestling fans would know that she's the person that gave Stone Cold Steve Austin his name. She told him, um, drink your tea before it becomes Stone Cold. She was British, and she was Austin's first manager in World Class, and Austin was trained by Chris Adams. But the whole Chris Adams shit was really crazy because in this documentary they talk about Chris Adams beating the shit out of people. His hotel manager in the Middle East, beating the shit out of this um, Japanese guy that was part of the Japanese mafia, and them being after him. So it's just, and Lady Blossom in her book Shattered Glass talks about when she was on LSD one time with Chris Adams and Gino Hernandez. And Gino Hernandez had her in the shower and actually pulled the gun on her. You know, crazy stories in the time of World Class Championship Wrestling. But when I look back, I never watched World Class because, again, I was in New York, and I didn't even start watching wrestling until like 1990. You know what I mean? And by then, World Class, the best years have been behind them. But I knew about the Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich doing what he did, and the tragedy of World Class Championship Wrestling. It's just sad, man. And I think, I said this with the Selena video. I said this in a lot of Michael Jackson videos. I think when a father or even a mother, but usually it's showbiz fathers, pushes their dreams and agendas onto a son or sons, it's never good for them psychologically. And Fritz von Erich never really got the glory that he wanted and never really became the NWA champion. And because he never really became that NWA champion, he pushed it onto his sons and wanted them to become, even though they didn't want to become, or in some cases, like Chris Von Erich, wasn't able to become that. You know what I mean? So he lived out his vision through his sons, lived vicariously through them, and he used religious beliefs and religious manipulations to get his sons to where he wanted them to be. But some of Fritz von Erich's religious associations were a little bit sketchy. Like there's this one story that um, he's wrestling um, he's wrestling Thunderbolt Patterson, who was a black star in the 1970s in the Georgia territory. And him and Fritz are going back and forth with Bible quotes. He's basically calling Von Erich a hypocrite. This is one of the ways Fritz turned babyface. In addition to when Stan Stasiak called his kids brats for the first time in '75. So, and the Southern Baptist Convention, who was, of course, notorious in 1960s politics for being against segregation. Of course, the religious right, Jerry Falwell, Liberty University, people like that. We all know that that coalition, that Christian coalition that Fritz von Erich was such a part of and that was broadcasting his TVs, were one of the main ones pushing against the desegregation of schools during Jimmy Carter's um, administration, and also the whole busing controversy. That's now George Wallace got popular during his election. So anyway, they had Thunderbolt Patterson removed from TV because they didn't want to see a black guy quoting biblical scriptures against a white guy, and Fritz von Erich maneuvered to have that happen. An interesting story about Fritz also revolving racism is during the 1950s when he was a popular heel, he came across a Jewish gentleman in the back. And the Jewish gentleman told him that he lost all his family in the Holocaust and that he didn't think that betraying a Nazi heel was the right thing to do. And he called him Jack. He called him by his real name, so he knew it was a gimmick. And he tells him, listen, he says the word gimmick is a Yiddish word, and that you shouldn't be doing this anti-Semitic character. So Fritz roughs him up in the back, and a little bit of blood spills on a piece of paper, and the piece of paper had Hebrew writing on it. And the Jewish guy says to him, I hope this never happens to you. But basically what happened to the Jewish guy, that he, uh, he lost all his kids in the Holocaust, and basically that's what happened to Fritz. Fritz lost all his children as well. Fritz himself later passed away from lung cancer, and after that, before that though, Doris left him. After Carrie Von Erich passing away, Doris had enough of Fritz's bullshit, and it was so similar to what we've seen from Michael Jackson's mom. It was like how much you want to push these kids. I know you have your peculiar religious beliefs. I know you have, out of the box way of living, and you want to create this idyllic Norman Rockwell type way of existence, but you can't do it through brutal force. You can't be a taskmaster about it. And I think that's what Fritz von Erich really was, a taskmaster about it. Peace, guys. Love you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And to the Von Erichs, man, that is a sad tragedy. And I can't wait to see the movie The Iron Claw and how they're going to depict this whole thing. And on a side note, postscript, check out Gary Hart's book, man, because Gary Hart, man, he tells it like it is. He and Fritz, he walked out of World Class Championship Wrestling, Christmas of '82, the Christmas of '82 show, because he felt like he wasn't getting, he wasn't getting um, the right recognition. Their first hires Ken Mantell. Ken Mantell's the one who ends up leaving him in '86 to go with Watts. So when Watts is moving into his territory, it's because of his booker, Ken Mantell, who was basically trying to sign away all his talent. There's a UWF card, a UWF Jim Crack Promotions card in 87. In 87, that features Chris Adams, features Iceman King Parsons, all basically the southern version of Vincent Vern. What Vincent Vern did to Vern Gagne, that's what Bill Watts did to Fritz von Erich. And Gary Hart told him Ken Mantell's a snake in the grass, and you can't trust him. And Gary Hart talks about how he came up with not how he came up with it, because it already existed, the character of the Great Kabuki, but he put the Great Kabuki on an actual Japanese guy. The former guy was a Filipino wrestler. But how he modified the Great Kabuki and how he came up with the mist is his son was baking cookies, and he decided, you know what? let me put mouthwash in this condom, and the mist gimmick is still used today by wrestlers like Asuka. You know what I mean? So I always wondered when I was younger how because I watched old Starrcade in '89 with Muda doing the mist, and I always wondered how they do the mist. But now I know they use a condom with food coloring, and then they spurt out like this. Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I think the Von Erich tragedy is sort of like, I was listening to this podcast. Shout out to the Labs Fan podcast, and they were comparing tragedy to Moby Dick, right? But I don't know. Frank Melville's book. I don't know. To me, I think the Von Erich family is sort of like the House of Atreus, the old Greek tragedy, the House of Atreus, which includes Menelaus and Agamemnon. Agamemnon, of course, the king that is the king when Troy falls at the hands of the Achaeans in Homer, and Menelaus was basically the cause of the fall of Troy. Well, long story short, in his family in the House of Atreus, all the people have something negative happen to them. Just like with the Von Erichs. You know what I mean? So I think the Von Erichs are more akin to something of a Greek tragedy than Harold Melville's Moby Dick. Peace. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love y'all.